We're glad to have you here tonight on colonial conflicts. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Michael McConnell, who is the author of To Risk It All, General Forbes, The Capture of Fort Duquesne, and the Course of Empire in the Ohio Country. The book just came out a year or so ago. You can see it right here. A very attractive book. I've read it and very much recommend it. Good evening, Dr. McConnell. We're glad to have you with us.
Good evening. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. Well, let me tell folks a little bit more about you, the folks in our audience. Dr. McConnell is a native of Western Pennsylvania, makes sense, and earned his Ph.D. in early American history in 1983 from the College of William and Mary. He retired in 2008 as associate professor after 24 years with the Department of History, University of Alabama-Birmingham. And he, in addition to his latest book, he has also written two well-known books to those who study colonial warfare, the French and Indian War, Western Pennsylvania, the Ohio Valley, one being A Country Between the Upper Ohio Valley and Its Peoples, 1724 to 1774, and Army and Empire, British Soldiers on the American Frontier from 1758 to 1775. So again, Dr. McConnell, thanks for being with us, and good evening to you.
Good evening.
Good. So in your to get started, the title of your talk tonight includes the concept of coalition warfare. Can you give us a definition of that in the French and Indian wartime period, and who were the participants in these coalitions?
Well, the term coalition warfare I used as I discovered how the dynamics of this campaign were playing out. Basically, the coalition in this case involved General Forbes, his few hundred regular troops from Britain, and the forces from several mid-Atlantic colonies, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, as we talked earlier. In addition, he tried with very modest success to enlist the aid of Overhill Cherokee warriors. And he was also trying, at the same time that he was leading this army into the Ohio country against the French, he was also trying to make peace with the resident Indians in the Ohio country, principally Delawares, who lived north and west of then Fort Duquesne, later Pittsburgh. And so what began to dawn on me was that not only this, but also every other campaign, with few exceptions, in North America involves some combination of British and colonial and Indian participants. What struck me about the Forbes expedition was not only the complexity of this, but also the friction that this caused. And insofar as organizing and moving an army. Bear in mind that there were other contemporary campaigns. For example, General Abercrombie was moving a much larger army, something on the order of 15,000 troops, up the Champlain Valley, or I should say down the Champlain Valley, towards the St. Lawrence River. His army was made up roughly of half of New England troops. In 1759, there was another campaign, roughly the same size as the one Forbes led. This one followed the Mohawk Valley out into what's now Western New York with its aim being the taking of Fort Niagara. And that included several thousand New York troops and Iroquois participants. So in one sense, there's no unique quality to the Forbes campaign. What I found compelling were the politics behind it. And it's the politics of that coalition war in the Ohio Valley that I found particularly intriguing.
All right, why don't we give it a brief overview. I'll have Jen pull up the map of the Forbes expedition, and some of our audience members may not be familiar with it. General Forbes that we're talking about is Brigadier General John Forbes, whose objective was Fort Duquesne, which Michael, as you just said, is currently or now modern Pittsburgh, and his expedition really left from Philadelphia, had a kind of a joining up at Harrisburg, back then Harris's Ferry. And so what was Forbes' objective? And can you tell us about the two prior attempts to get English/Virginia/Pennsylvania control of the forks of the Ohio where Fort Duquesne was?
Sure. The only notable prior effort was, of course, the famous Braddock campaign in 1755. That originated in Virginia, was based in Northern Virginia, and the jump-off place was now it was called at the time Fort Cumberland, now Cumberland, Maryland. And they cut a road up through the Monongahela Valley. That attack, as we know, was dramatically unsuccessful. And the border war that campaign launched, in other words, Indians in the Ohio country taking advantage of Britain's defeat to basically launch their own war for their own purposes against the colonies of Pennsylvania and Virginia. That warfare along Pennsylvania and Virginia's border was such that the authorities, both at home and in London, felt that the violence needed to be stopped in order for these colonies to make their full contribution to the imperial war effort against the French. And of course, the only way to stop this border warfare was thought to be driving the French out of the upper Ohio Valley. They had a chain of forts, the principal of which was Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, but they also had outposts at what's now Franklin, Pennsylvania, Fort Machaut, at the mouth of LeBoeuf Creek, which was called Fort LeBoeuf, named after buffalo, by the way, woods buffalo that roamed Western Pennsylvania at that time. And the third link in the chain was farther north at Erie, Fort Presque Isle. And so the thought was that if we move an army against Fort Duquesne, we can roll up the French in the Ohio country, and thus perhaps through some deft negotiation and some good luck, eliminate this border war that Pennsylvania and Virginia, Pennsylvania in particular, was suffering from in 1755 through 58. What makes the Forbes campaign different in that respect is Forbes' decision to base his army in Pennsylvania. That was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, Virginians, notably, and Marylanders, like Governor Sharp, assumed that Forbes would also follow the southern route. Since Braddock's Road was already built, it wouldn't take much to repair, and it was allegedly shorter and more direct. Everybody knew it. And Forbes pulled something of a surprise. He chose to move through Pennsylvania. His reasons for doing so, I think, were quite deft and quite well-founded. If you look at the economic dynamics of Northern Virginia as opposed to Eastern Pennsylvania, there's really no contest as far as who can best supply wagons, livestock, food, forage, and all importantly, money, cash money. Philadelphia can do that much better than can anywhere in Northern Virginia. Philadelphia is a major port. It has access to money through trade and credit. It has access to a very rich hinterland. In fact, one of the perpetually richest agricultural regions in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so for these reasons, among a host of others, Forbes increasingly came to believe that an overland march was not only feasible, but the best choice he could make. Bear in mind that he was also drawing the majority of his troops from the Pennsylvania, Maryland area. And North Carolina was only supposed to supply 4 companies, which turned out to be around 200 men. Virginia supplied 2 regiments, one Washington's, which had been in existence since late 1755, and a new one raised just for this campaign. But the bulk of the manpower and the bulk of the supplies that Forbes would need were going to be drawn from southwestern Pennsylvania. It was also clear that there were ways of getting across the Allegheny Mountains. There were traders' paths, notably the Juniata Path, which, while it's not shown here, runs roughly according to the red line from Carlisle to Raystown. In other words, the passage through much of Pennsylvania was well known. In fact, a point I make in the book is that the real Forbes Road, the Wilderness Road, hacked out of the old stand timber, didn't really begin until the Army reached Raystown, which was an old trader's settlement. From that point east, the going was relatively easy, thanks in part to the deer hide trade from Pennsylvania, thanks in part to new settlements such as Harris's, to the east, Lancaster, and the new town, Carlisle, to the west. And also the area around the Susquehanna Valley, both east and west, were well known to people. People used this area to migrate not only east-west, but more especially north-south. This is the northern end of what Virginians called the Great Wagon Road that carried settlers from Philadelphia. They took a hard left at Harris's, and they trekked south through the Shenandoah Valley towards central Virginia, founding Loudoun County, Bedford County, and so forth, and ending up in the Mennonite settlements of Western North Carolina and Western Georgia. So getting at least as far as the Susquehanna River seemed not to be a problem. Another aspect of Forbes's decision, which is interesting in that the person responsible came back to haunt Forbes repeatedly during the course of the campaign. His quartermaster general, Lieutenant Colonel Sinclair, had served as quartermaster general of Braddock's army. And by 1758, he was no well the better for it. He carried a bullet in his breast that he took on the Monongahela with Braddock's. And he wrote a letter, part of a longer report, and apparently drummed this point home to Forbes after he gained the appointment as quartermaster general to Forbes's army. And that was that the experience of Braddock's army proved to him that the road from Philadelphia was indeed the road that the army should have taken in 1755. It would have been more secure. It would have been able to draw on more resources. And in fact, Sinclair undertook to cut a roadway linking the Great Wagon Road with the river systems in Western Pennsylvania. Though it's not shown here, there is a major branch running east and south of the Monongahela River called the Youghiogheny. And what St. Clair wanted to do was to cut a road that linked the existing paths, roads in eastern Pennsylvania with the Youghiogheny Valley, thinking that this would then allow the army to transport supplies and personnel more quickly. It's interesting to note that the person placed in charge of cutting this new road was nonetheless no one other than James Byrd, spelled B-U-R-D, who in 1758 commanded one of 3 Pennsylvania battalions and commanded the encampment at Loyalhannon for much of the campaign. So he was familiar with the road and with the possibility of moving across the mountains. Now, I say that this came back to haunt Bouquet because continually through the campaign, St. Clair let him down in his capacity as quartermaster general. In other words, the person in the army most responsible for picking the route, moving the army, moving its supplies, picking its encampments, and so forth. He continually, for lack of a better term, I'll say screwed up. He didn't have forage where it was needed. He began to cast doubts on a Western road. And for this reason, Forbes, on his way west, was plagued by doubt. Have I made the right decision here? But to Forbes's credit, he stuck with it. He stuck with his decision, and it worked. By the time he got to Raystown, he had gone 2/3 of the way to his objective. And at that point, the road building really began. The only thing that worked against Forbes was the weather. He couldn't move west until the cold weather had lifted in the area directly west of the Susquehanna River, so as to provide fresh fodder for his horses. He had to get, or at least he thought he had to get, to Fort Duquesne and back, at least as far as Carlisle, before the onset of the notoriously nasty Appalachian Mountains, Western Pennsylvania winter. And so from his perspective, the element of time played a crucial role. In his letters, he's constantly referring to, I am here. I need to be at some point down the road. And he faced this pressure throughout the campaign, added to which his army, made up of a coalition of jealously self-governing colonies like Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, each with its own agenda, had raised ample troops. He starts out with an army of roughly 7,000 men. Now, by comparison, Braddock made his advance with roughly 2,500. So Forbes has a big army. The catch is much of this army is raised for the campaign. Troops are raised in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and they sign on for 1 year. And that year ends December 1st. So as he moves west in the face of physical obstacles, in the face of his own quartermaster general, in the face of increasing political friction among and between these colonies, he also has to bear in mind that as of December 1st, he's going to lose about 3,000 men from his army. One whole regiment from Virginia will disband, and roughly a third of Pennsylvania's regiment will disband. And given normal attrition, that means that he's not going to have much of an army left when he gets to his objective. So all of this is putting pressure on Forbes. And the irony of it is that Forbes himself is rarely with the advancing army. Because this campaign is a sort of shoestring enterprise, and because much of his regular force is late, having to come by water from South Carolina, from Britain, Forbes himself has to stay behind in Philadelphia until well into June, best campaigning weather, waiting for his Highland Regiment to come up from Charleston, South Carolina, waiting for his ordnance stores to come in by ship from Britain. And by ordnance stores, I mean his artillery, ammunition, gunpowder, all of the things that an army needs to function as an army. And so he's playing catch up through much of this campaign. When the army's at Carlisle, he's still in Philadelphia. When the army's at Raystown, he's at Carlisle. When the army's at Loyalhannon, which is 50 miles west of Raystown, he's beginning to catch up. He finally gets to Raystown in October, by which time the army has already arrived. And part of what's keeping Forbes back, other than the length of the trip, his need to manage the administration of this army, is Forbes' own ill health. A question that is quite open, actually. We don't know exactly what Forbes suffered from. That he suffered from something quite debilitating is evident from his letters, the letters of his subordinates. He writes a letter back home when he arrives in New York in 1757, announcing his arrival, and tells the recipient, who happens to be a member of his family, that he has suffered somewhat from what he calls his old complaint. So in other words, what is troubling Forbes predates his arrival in Pennsylvania or New York. He's suffering from a variety of symptoms that are hard to diagnose. His hands swell, his feet swell, he loses his diet, he has constipation, he suffers from dysentery, he can't ride a horse, he can't ultimately write his own letters. Much of his correspondence is in fact in the hand of his military secretary, or others because he himself is simply incapable of writing. And all through the campaign, other people are speculating about his health. Now, did he have health conditions, or did those health conditions include cancer? Hard to say. I consulted a physician, and he suggested that the triggering effect was in his digestive system. Whatever it was, it continually ate away at him until finally, when he did get back to Philadelphia in the spring of 1759, no one expected him to survive. In fact, there are letters from his superiors in which one person in particular, General Abercrombie, says, "Gee, I haven't heard from Forbes for a couple of months. I'm beginning to think he's already dead." And that's another problem that he faces. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the central figure in all of this is indeed Forbes. He keeps this army moving. He makes the crucial decisions. And whether through an intuitive sense, whether through dumb luck, or whether a combination of factors, he's proven right. He actually gets onto his objective and takes Fort Duquesne. But he doesn't do it alone. He seeks the help of Southern Indians. They prove to be no help at all. He also seeks a diplomatic initiative with the Indians living in the Ohio country. That turns out to be a more fruitful avenue of approach.
Michael, let me go back to your comment about the choice of roads, because you go into quite a lot of depth. In fact, probably more depth than I've seen in other handling of this question. And George Washington, who eventually, of course, was on this expedition all the way to Fort Duquesne, he and some of his backers, including Virginia civil authorities, petitioned and complained about the choice of the Pennsylvania route rather than the Braddock route, to the point where Forbes basically had to chastise Washington in a letter. Washington almost embarrassed himself. What was there anything else going on in Washington's world for him to argue so strenuously for the old Braddock route rather than the route that Forbes eventually carved out?
Well, I think fundamentally the issue, and this gets back to the point of coalition warfare, the issue for Washington is, how will this campaign benefit Virginia? He's a Virginian. And he went as a private aide-de-camp with Braddock, experienced the defeat of Braddock's army outside Fort Duquesne, but nonetheless was impressed that you could get an army up to the forks of the Ohio. What's going through Washington's mind is clearly what all of this means for Virginia. He is first and foremost a Virginian. He is connected through his half-brother Lawrence with something called the Virginia Company, or the Ohio Company of Virginia, I'm sorry. It's chartered in 1749 through the efforts of the then governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, in an effort to carve out several 100,000 acres of land that large Virginia landowners will acquire. They will then either use this land themselves for tobacco growing, or they will rent it out and collect rents on the real estate. In either case, a lot of powerful people in Virginia, including Washington, at least indirectly, stand to gain from using the Virginia Road. But we should bear in mind that both Pennsylvania and Maryland are also playing the same game. Pennsylvania military leaders in the Army write letters and they say, gee, we're going to go through Pennsylvania. Isn't that a great idea? That will really benefit our country. That will benefit us. Governor Sharp, in the meantime, in Annapolis, Maryland, is trying to get a road cut from Annapolis to Big Pool, Maryland, where Fort Frederick is, and from there out to Fort Cumberland, hoping that Maryland will benefit from the movement of the Army.
Sure.
Across the Appalachians. And so there's a lot of competition. Everybody sees the end game. The end game really for Pennsylvanians, Marylanders, and especially Virginians is not driving the French out of Fort Duquesne. And that's what angers Forbes, because that is his end mission. What for them is important is what driving the French out means for their particular colonies. And they're all jockeying for position, not because the Ohio country itself is that rich, though it's interesting that scouting parties go up through the Monongahela Valley. They scout the new Forbes Road, and they're forever writing down in their journals, saw really good land, saw land that I would love to farm. Great trees, great meadows, wonderful place to raise cattle. They're thinking in these terms. But more importantly, if they get to the forks of the Ohio, they have an avenue to the real goodies, which is down the Ohio River in the Middle West, in what's now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. They're aiming for the pot at the end of the rainbow. Vast, untold acres of fertile farmland that, as I say, could be worked to grow tobacco or could be farmed, much like Southeast Pennsylvania, or turned into sharecropping arrangements. Either way, the landowners will win, and they will win big. Reflect on the pre-revolutionary history of this region. When the British slap an embargo on traveling and settling west after 1763, when they start to draw lines down through the Appalachian Mountains, that irritates the living daylights out of people who wonder, what the home government is doing that is doing us such a disservice by preventing us from taking ownership of that land. And one of the key arguments in the origins of the revolution has always been British restrictiveness after 1763 to prevent the kind of Indian wars that did break out in 1763 and again in 1774 by restricting settlement. Bear in mind, the British, from their position thousands of miles away, were equally terrified that if they simply opened the West, carte blanche, that the old colonies would be drained of people.
Right.
And they would be going west, farther from the reach of imperial writ, in much the same way as British landowners in Northern England, Scotland, Ireland frowned upon and bemoaned the massive migrations of people out of those areas to America in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. We're losing people, which means we're losing money and we're losing power. And so I think that's what's going through Washington's head, most especially. I think also Washington is one of the few people associated with this army who you could rightfully call a veteran of the 7 Years' War. By 1758, he spent 3 years shaping and organizing what becomes the 1st Virginia Regiment. He gets something of a local notoriety. That notoriety convinces him that there are greater things awaiting him. At one point, he actually petitions the American commander-in-chief, the Earl of Loudoun, in 1757 to place the 1st Virginia Regiment on the British regular establishment, which was unheard of. That never happened, but Washington boasted at the time that his regiment was the equal of anything the British could bring to America from Europe. It had seasoned men in it and had worked hard in protecting the frontier since the fall of 1758, or since the fall of 1755. Also, I think Washington saw himself as something of a local authority. He writes Forbes very early and tries to warn him about, if you enlist Indians, here's what you need to expect. He is something of a self-taught master of warfare. And I think that gets to him. Washington is still, remember, a very young man. And in this respect, he's still very unseasoned. He commands troops, yes, but has not been a functional part of an army. He served as a private secretary to Braddock, not commanding any troops. So when he gets to the point where he joins this army, he's ordered to stay at Fort Cumberland and put up a blind, basically keep the French occupied looking south. He's ordered to send men out and patrol the old road, cut it to make like the army is preparing to use it. In other words, to hold the French attention. In the meantime, the main event is going on several hundred miles to the north. I suspect Washington felt left out and a little bit resentful as a Virginian that his advice was not being taken. His exchange of letters with Colonel Henry Bouquet, Forbes' second in command, and a professional European soldier, are revealing of Washington's attitudes. He writes to Bouquet almost at times as if he's teaching Bouquet, lecturing Bouquet about how we ought to do things. And he keeps pleading for a southern road. And at the same time, he tends to back off and say, now, I'm just saying this as a good soldier. You're going to make whatever decision you want, but I'm just telling you how things are. And of course, when the decision is made to continue west through Pennsylvania, Washington is flabbergasted. I suspect he feels unwanted. He feels as though his word is not carrying sufficient weight. And I think his cockiness gets the best of him. The letter that Forbes finds when he writes that I found an unguarded letter from Washington and Byrd writing about the road I think that letter was one of several that Washington wrote to Halkett, Major Halkett, who was Forbes's secretary and his assistant. Washington knew the Halkett family. Halkett's older brother and his father both died with Braddock on the Monongahela. Whether Halkett put that letter out for Forbes to see, whether he told Forbes about it, or whether Forbes just got nosy and was snooping around the incoming mail, I don't know. But Forbes was furious. And what infuriated him was what he called factions. The sorts of factions that grow out of coalition warfare. In this case, between Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and the British Empire. He represents what he thinks is the ultimate authority, the crown. He's getting his orders from George II through William Penn and the commander-in-chief of the army, Lord Ligonier. He will not countenance the kind of friction that he's introduced to quite early in the colonies, where he sees Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania squabbling with each other, backbiting each other, waiting to find out what the neighboring colony is going to raise by way of men and money before we make a commitment. And he, at one point, alludes to similar factionalism eating away at Abercrombie's army way up north on Lake Champlain. And he said, that's one reason why Abercrombie was defeated. Factions between provincials, we assume, and regulars. And he swears he will not have it in his army. And he's at that point ready to cut Washington and other complainers loose.
Let me ask you a last question about the campaign itself as the column moved west before we get to questions. And let me remind our audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them after we finish. But Michael, at some point after the column passed Raystown, you write in your book, in one of the, I guess it's the second to last chapter, I think, that there be among the officers, including Washington and Byrd and Forbes, there was some doubt whether they were going to have not only the time to get to Fort Duquesne and presumably lay siege to it before December 1st, but they also had to take into account the weather and logistics. So can you just wrap up the last maybe 3 or 4 weeks here, where at some point they had to make a decision whether to go to Fort Duquesne and risk it all and maybe not get there by December 1st and maybe not get there in good weather versus turning around and trying it again the next year? What happened out there?
Well, what happened was simply, by the time the army reached Raystown, it was traveling blind. Southern Indian recruits, principally Cherokee and Catawba, were proving less than ideal for getting information about numbers, where the French were, and so forth. They were also in the middle of the mountains, so they had to move rapidly. The weather was getting worse because the time element was wearing on them. They went to Loyal Hand Encampment, which is now the town of Ligonier. And it's at that point that the decisions have to be made. Bouquet blunders once in sending a strong reconnaissance force towards Fort Duquesne. For what purpose is unclear, but if it was an attempt to seize the fort by a coup de main, it failed. Major Grant was captured, his force decimated, and fled all the way back to Loyal Hannon. The French retaliated the next month and attacked Loyal Hannon. It wasn't much of an attack. Roughly 100 troops were killed or wounded out of several thousand in the encampment, but they drove off a good deal of the Army's livestock. In other words, this French raid was a spoiling attack. Hopefully they would catch Forbes in the mountains in bad weather and give themselves several months. So Forbes has to come to some decision. It's starting to snow. Do we go on? Do we turn around and go back? As luck would have it, and it's pure dumb luck, an out party of the army at Loyal Hannon collides with a group of French and Indians a few miles west of what becomes Fort Ligonier, the Loyal Hannon encampment. In the process of this, the colonial troops prove once again their limited abilities. Two columns fire into each other. Washington breaks it up, but they capture an individual, a white man who claims that he's an escapee from the Indians. He may have been a renegade. Whatever he was, he told Forbes, look, there are only a couple of hundred men at Fort Duquesne. All of the French Indian allies have left. They've taken their booty from Grant's defeat from Loyal Hannon, and they've gone home. Nobody left. And it's at that point in mid-November that Forbes rolls the dice and says, okay, we go. And he takes a flying column, 2,500 men, basically all the functioning troops he has, and pushes them down the road the last 50 miles to Fort Duquesne. As he approaches, the French get wind of this, and we all know what happened. They blow the fort up. They disperse up the Allegheny River, down the Ohio. But Forbes actually is able to get to his objective late in the year. At very end of November, he writes letters congratulating the government on the capture of Fort Duquesne. But it's at that moment in mid-November that things really begin to come together for Forbes. In the meantime, he called a council of officers together into a council of war, and they'd all but decided that they better turn around and go home as best they can. And then this renegade captain shows up, and all bets are off. And Forbes, within 24 hours, he sends out orders. Within 48 hours, the troops are moving down the road, and they're moving so quickly, they're not even cutting a road. They're just cutting branches. They're cutting saplings down to give themselves a right-of-way. They're using a few pack horses. They're carrying virtually no artillery. They're running to get to the fort, which they do.
Right. Okay, why don't we take a few questions here from our audience. My friend Tom, who's on with us tonight, is asking about which regiment Henry Timberlake and Thomas Sumter were in for the Virginians. Do you remember that part?
Yeah, Timberlake was actually in the regulars. He was a member of the 17th Foot when he went out to the Cherokee towns. Sumter, I don't know. I honestly can't give an answer to that.
Okay.
But Timberlake, I know, was serving in the regular army in the late 1760s.
Mhm. Okay, we have a similar question by William, and coincidentally, Michael and I were just talking about this. William asks, who commanded the North Carolina regiments on Forbes' expedition? Well, William, I'm gonna ask Michael to give you the liberty to answer that, since my master's work and dissertation work is directly involved
Go
with that
right ahead.
question. There were actually not a full regiment of North Carolinians with Forbes this time, but they were commanded by Hugh Waddell. He was kind of the George Washington, the young George Washington of North Carolina. And since you bring that up, Waddell was also instrumental in the 1766 to 1771 North Carolina so-called War of the Regulation. And tomorrow night, Professor Marjolaine Kars is going to be with us to talk about that as well. But having studied the North Carolinians for quite a while, this was one of the better contingents that they sent out to help with the war effort, but not much is known about them. So thank you, William. We have another question, Michael. One of our audience members asked, at what point between either Philadelphia and Carlisle and Fort Duquesne did the French realize that they might be in big trouble, and what did they do about it?
Well, the point at which they discover that there is a potential for trouble coming at them from the east is during Grant's defeat, when Grant's column is sent from the Loyal Hand encampment to reconnoiter, to storm. We don't really know exactly what he was intended to do, but his 800 men get within a half a mile of the fort. They are roundly defeated. But what the French begin to notice is that many of the fugitives from that battle, if you want to call it that, flee eastward. They don't run south, they go east. And what that suggests to me are a couple of things, one of which is that the French are about as ill served by their Indian allies as Forbes is with his. In other words, if Forbes can't get any factual information about French movements, the size of the French forces at Fort Duquesne, what the fort looks like, the French are not able to get much information themselves on what is coming at them over the mountains. They are fixated on Forbes's road. That much is clear from their correspondence. They keep looking south. Now, why they would assume that the British would use the same road twice, I don't know. But it's not until, I would say, mid-September that the French get on to the idea that there might be a British army moving westward. And of course, they then ascertain where that army is. They locate it at Loyal Hannon, and they attack it in mid-October, not so much to destroy it. They can't hope to do that. The best estimates are that there are about 600 French and Indians in this raid. But what they want to do is destroy livestock, run off livestock, destroy cattle. So it's in that window from September to October.
Okay, we have another question on George Washington. What was George Washington's rank during this expedition?
He was a full colonel in the Virginia Army, if you want to call it that, which meant that thanks to changes put in place by King George II, he ranked as an equal with any colonel in the British Army. The only thing that would matter would be date of rank. So in other words, if he as colonel were to meet Major James Grant of the 77th Highlanders, he could give Grant orders, and Grant would be obliged to obey them because of this change. Initially, the king dictated that field officers in the colonial forces, which is to say majors, lieutenant colonels, colonels, general officers, could rank no higher than eldest captain in the regulars. And that's what prompted Washington to quit. He simply resigned his commission as colonel of a Virginia regiment, which is broken up in any event, made into independent companies. He serves as a private aide to Braddock, and then is appointed colonel once again of the new Virginia regiment at the end of 1755. And that's the rank he holds until he leaves the army in the winter of 1758.
Mhm. Okay, Michael McConnell, author of To Risk It All, a great book about the 1758 Forbes campaign. Thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
When you get a chance, please come visit us at the National Museum of the U.S. Army so we can show you all of our colonial artifacts and history down, and hope you'll come see us. Again, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you and enjoyed the subject, and we really appreciate you supporting us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure. And I wish you the best of luck in the future with your
Great,
program
thank you.
and your exhibits.
And let me also thank our producer, Jen Dabina, and our audience who came from all over the country and all over the world. So thank you and good evening to everybody.